Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see such a terrific crowd this afternoon. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to a conversation this afternoon with former U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and Professor Dan Byman of our Walsh School of Foreign Service. Our topic, as you know, is a large one, nothing less than the global future of security. And as a quick look at the headlines makes clear, we're really facing a wide range of security challenges today, more varied than perhaps any time in recent memory, certainly many of them unprecedented. There is the familiar great power rivalry, a perennial issue, but also terrorism and nuclear proliferation. And there are new threats linked with climate change, cybersecurity, mass migration, and other dimensions of globalization. So how should the United States and the international community respond to these and other security challenges in the years ahead? And how can Georgetown, as a university with our strengths around security in the SFS and across our other schools, make a positive contribution? These are some of the questions we'll be exploring this afternoon. Now, today's event is sponsored by Georgetown's Global Futures Initiative, a university-wide effort to highlight and to build on Georgetown's strengths around 4 global issues across 4 semesters through events with world leaders like this one and through support for research and teaching. As many of you know, we began last spring with the global future of development. We turned to global governance last semester. We're looking at security this semester. And in our final semester in the fall, we'll be looking at the global future of the environment. Many of you joined us earlier this semester for our first in a series of events around global security with Zainab Bangura, the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. I want to alert you to the event after this one, which will be with the Executive Director of the UN World Food Program on the future of global food security. Another fascinating topic. I invite you to learn more about the Global Futures Initiative on our website and through the materials available at the back of the room. So today we are honored to welcome Secretary Chuck Hagel, the 24th U.S. Secretary of Defense, a position he held from February 2013 to February 2015. Secretary Hagel has had a long and distinguished career in public service, having served 2 terms in the United States Senate from 1997 to 2009, representing the state of Nebraska. Before his election to the U.S. Senate, Secretary Hagel worked in many leadership positions in industry, including in telecommunications and investment banking, and as Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration under President Ronald Reagan. It's worth noting, very notable, I think, that when he stepped into the role of Defense Secretary, he did so as the first Vietnam veteran in that position and as the first enlisted combat veteran to serve. There's much more I could say about your distinguished career in international security. I would like to end with a Georgetown note. You've long been part of our community. You served from 2009 to 2013 as a distinguished professor in the practice of national governance here at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, and we're delighted that you continue to be part of our extended university community. Secretary Hagel will be joined, as I mentioned, by my colleague Dan Byman, a professor in the Security Studies program in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and in the Department of Government. Dan is known to many of you. He previously served as director of Georgetown Security Studies program and of our Center for Security Studies from 2005 to 2010. And today he is a senior associate dean within the School of Foreign Service, a leading expert on international security and the author and editor of many articles and several books. Byman also serves as senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. So, thank you all for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Chuck Hagel and Professor Dan Byman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're talking about the global future of security, as Tom mentioned, and really, I can't imagine a better person than Secretary Hagel. And I won't add to Tom's description of his biography, except to note very briefly that he's approached security and what security means from many perspectives. And that's very much what we try to do here at Georgetown, right, is to take a very broad definition of security and also a very broad definition of understanding what the challenges are. So I'm really delighted that he's going to be the one today who's going to be looking at this question with us. So with that in mind, let me just ask a big overview question, Mr. Secretary. What do you feel are the primary security threats to the United States and the world today, and what do you think are the primary security threats the world in general should be dealing with?
Dan, first, thank you for your participation and your continued leadership at this institution and what you have done to contribute to the overall understanding of a big challenge for our country and the world. And to Tom, thank you for your generous introduction into the Georgetown institution itself. I'm always appreciative for opportunities to connect with Georgetown because of not just what this institution represents, but the tremendous amount of contributions that flow from this school and our students and the professors and everyone associated. So thank you for an opportunity to share some thoughts. Dan, I think we first have to recognize that we, and you alluded to this, Tom did generally, that we are living in a global community, all of us, 7 billion global citizens. And that global community is underpinned by a global economy. And so everything that happens in the world today, regardless of where it happens and what happens, is connected to our security. After World War II, the United States embarked, along with its allies and its partners. There's a distinction between allies and partners. But we embarked on something that had never been tried ever in the history of man, and that was a global security arrangement that was predicated on an architecture of alliances. Those alliances were built on the common interests of people, whether they were economic interests, whether they were educational, demographic, imperfect. There were differences. There would continue to be differences, but that alliance dimension that produced a series of coalitions of common interests built in the 10 years after World War II. The United Nations, IMF, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is now WTO. The most important and effective collective security arrangement in the history of man, NATO, was built. So I start there in answering your question because I think it's important that we frame up how we have been able to navigate in a continuously complicated world since World War II. And it's not going to get any less complicated because, if nothing else, there will be 2 billion more global citizens on this earth in the next 30 years, according to demographers. Our interests are going to continue to collide, both in positive ways and negative ways. The reach for potable water, for energy, for jobs, based on the most fundamental of human dimensions, hope, possibilities. All of that now is intertwined into the threat system like never before. So when you ask the question, then what are our greatest threats? Our greatest threats are, first, I think, a deterioration of that architecture. And we are seeing a fraying of some of that now in the world. Let's take the European Union. As a result of Syrian refugees and war refugees from the Middle East that will continue, you're seeing an EU fray at the edges. You may see governments go down in Europe over this. What is going on in Great Britain, which is a long time coming, a referendum coming up in a few months on whether the British should exit from the European Union. That is dramatic. That's significant. NATO, the question of NATO based on an obligation of NATO members, of all 28 nations, they're part of NATO, to fulfill a commitment to belong to NATO of having 2% of your gross domestic product go to defense. There are only 4 countries of the 28 now that are even close to that or even over it. 24 are not, and most are going the other way. So any measurement you want to apply to this world of alliances and relationships and partnerships that's lasted for over 70 years, essentially a world order that's now shifting, I think is one of the great threats. Second, how are we to then, we being the world, not just the United States, but the world, because our interests are connected everywhere. They're connected to our partners in Asia Pacific, our treaty obligations there, our treaty obligations and partnerships and alliances in Europe and around the world. So we are all connected. And how do we build upon those alliances as we adapt to these new threats that are not just threats to the United States security, but to the world, cyber attacks? I think cyber warfare represents the most ingenious, insidious, and real and growing threat to our security as any one threat. There are other threats. There is still a nuclear threat, chemical weapons, an inventory of real-time threats. Terrorism is a vehicle to deliver those threats. Terrorism has been around since man's been on 2 legs. It's not a government, it's not a philosophy, it's not an ideology. It is a tool to essentially use these insidious weapons for various reasons. It's not to establish, in almost every case today that we're dealing with non-state threats, a better world, the complete upside-down use of religion, then the abuse of what a religion means to most people, as you have inverted that to the lowest common denominator of what ISIS uses, for example, as building an Islamic caliphate modeled on the old Ottoman Empire. That's not governance, and we know enough about these non-nation states and threats and what they have been doing to know clearly that they're not about governing or making the world a better world. So I think it's a long way around to answer maybe what should be a short answer to a short question. But I think in order to answer that fully and for us to all comprehend what's ahead, that we need to step back and kind of frame up some reference points that we Americans, quite frankly, are not good at. We make most of our biggest mistake is when we don't review history and we don't understand what we're getting into. And then we ask a series of questions that should always be asked at the front end before any policy is agreed to, a series of questions, and then what happens, then what happens, then what happens. And we're particularly not good at remembering Newton's law. For every action, there's a reaction. And we're smarter, I hope, today, although if you look at our politics in America today, it doesn't appear we are, but I think we'll sober up eventually, but that's another question.
I'll stay away from that particular question, but let me ask
You know, I picked up bad habits in the Senate. I can't tell you. I can't get away from those. But,
you mentioned that the cyber threat is ingenious, insidious. What would you say are some of the kind of immediate concerns we should be looking at when we talk about cyber and the long term? And then I think even more importantly, what do we do about it? How do we meet these threats?
well, I think everyone understands cyber well enough, and I'm no expert on any of it. I'm no expert on anything, but I probably understand it fairly well. The different jobs I've had, but the reason it is such a threat as opposed to the other threats that are out there, and they're all threats, and that's not to minimize still a nuclear threat or a chemical weapons attack or a biological weapons attack, not at all. But the reason cyber represents a new kind of a threat is because it is quiet. It is so deadly in that you don't know for a while where it actually came from. You can't always be sure who was the attacker. You don't know it's coming. There's no kind of advanced intelligence like refueling rockets or fueling rockets and so on and so on. Our intelligence can pick a lot of things up. You're not moving one soldier anywhere. You're not putting one airplane in the air. You're not opening any launch doors anywhere. You're not moving any ships anywhere. You're not threatening anybody anywhere. All of a sudden, it's there. And you don't have to attack a military or what we believe maybe as a defined asset for our security, an aircraft carrier group or an Air Force wing or a division of soldiers. You don't have to attack them. You paralyze a power grid or many power grids. You paralyze and destroy a financial center and financial institutions. You paralyze satellites that our Defense Department uses, and everything in the world today is computerized. That's the main reason it is so dangerous. Technology always stays ahead of defense. That's why in regulation for anything, the markets will always beat regulation because regulation can never, ever get ahead of the markets or any dimension of the markets. Both people playing it straight and by the book and those who are not. And so we are dealing with the same kind of a dynamic here. How do you fix it? How do you deal with it? Well, the United States is better prepared than any nation on earth by far. And everyone is moving in the right direction. But again, I think here too, it's a good example of alliances. We have to continue to strengthen our alliances with our allies, our friends, our partners. Even though we have differences with countries, and will continue, to paralyze different countries' banking systems or their economic heart, which would create tremendous chaos inside a country. That's in everyone's interest, including China's, Russia's, the United States, every country that has any kind of a functioning government and any kind of a responsible government. And I draw the line between a democracy and kind of a democracy, or sometimes a democracy. And it is, again, going back to what I said earlier after World War II, let's focus on self-interest. Let's focus on our common interests that we have. The technological aspect of this, which we're ahead of everybody on, although the Russians are very good, the Chinese are good, the Iranians are good, the North Koreans are good. ISIS is sophisticated. ISIS is far more sophisticated in use of cyber, Facebook, than most nations. So it's not just a nation-state power and capability today. That's what technology has given for both good and bad the world. So that's first, strengthen our alliances. Second, what we can do internally here, and which we've really failed at, is that the real strength and the powers and the assets that we have in the United States to deal with cyber attacks resides in the government of the United States. NSA, Cyber Command, Pentagon, not in the private sector. And interestingly enough, even the dysfunction of our own federal government. Give you an example. I just mentioned the two specific agencies that have the most power and assets within the overall umbrella of the Defense Department. Even though they have the assets, they don't have the legal authority to protect and use cyber to protect this country. People say, well, what do you mean by that? When we rolled up 22 agencies and departments within the 2-year period after 9/11, when we, the Congress, did, and I was in the Senate at the time and remember vividly those long meetings. One of the committees I was on was the Intelligence Committee. We gave the Department of Homeland Security the authority, Homeland Security, to protect the homeland, to protect the security of this country and everything inside the boundaries of this country. Now, that didn't eliminate DOD's responsibility, but DOD's responsibility, when you think of it, is very limited inside the United States. You have police forces, you have National Guard, part of DOD, but it's enforcement, law enforcement. You don't have military, U.S. military patrolling the streets and out running around in jeeps. So it's a different authority asset balance here. And what the Congress has to do, and they've not done, and the next president's going to have to do this with the Congress, the next Congress, is that we've got to pass new cyber legislation that builds the bridges to be able to do that better inside our government, and also allows our federal government's assets, the Department of Homeland Security, the authority, and DOD's assets, to be used far more capably in helping the private sector within the boundaries of privacy and law. And that's our biggest challenge right now. We don't have those bridges to get across to allow these departments that have the assets, the capability to do that. When I was Secretary of Defense, and we were being cut our budget all the time, I was the first Secretary of Defense that had to deal with sequestration. 5 days after I got there on the job, sequestration hit, and all of our senior leaders came in and said, we're now in the middle of taking an additional $50 billion cut this year that we've not budgeted for. So what do we do? Welcome to the Pentagon. Well, we got through it, but here's the reason I mention that, is that I presented 2 budgets to the Congress for the Department of Defense, and because we were being cut constantly, and still are, dangerously so in my opinion, there were only 2 areas that I requested increases in when I was Secretary of Defense. One was cyber, 7,000 new professionals to go into this, and about $5 billion more in funding. And the other was special operations. Because I think, and it's what one of my predecessors, Bob Gates, said a few years ago, any future Secretary of Defense, whoever advises the President of the United States to get the United States into a land war in the Middle East ought to have his head examined. I would actually go further than that, but Gates is right, and I don't think, and you prepare for everything you must, that the next few years you're going to see America be dropping in 200,000 troops on the ground and essentially invading and occupying a country. I sure as hell hope not. But it's going to be special operations working with cyber and adapting to your original set of questions about the threats and what do you do about them.
Let me ask you about people who need their head examined a little bit. As you know, people who went into senior positions in the Obama administration and the president himself were extremely critical of the Bush administration for invading Iraq and for handling of the subsequent occupation. There was criticism of the Obama administration for its handling of Libya, especially after the overthrow of Gaddafi. And there's been tremendous criticism of the Obama administration for not intervening more aggressively in Syria. And recently, a couple days ago, we had a Marine who died in Iraq as part of what seems to be a almost intervention in Iraq happening backwards, where U.S. forces are being deployed, but just in small numbers, but increasing numbers, while people are still very critical about the rationale and about the scope of this operation. There's criticism if you intervene a lot, if you try to get intervene a bit but not too much in Libya, or if you don't intervene at all in Syria. How should we think about intervention in the Middle East?
Well, I would say the question could be broadened to how do we think about intervention anywhere?
Fair point.
We Americans have over the years taken a pretty cavalier approach to all that because I think most Americans alive today, of the 320 million of us, were born during World War II or after World War II. I suppose almost everybody in this room fits that category. I was born in 1946. My father came back from 2.5 years overseas in World War II. My mother and father were married on Valentine's Day, 1946, and I was born 9 months later in October of 1946. And it was 9 months, I've checked. But when you're in politics, you don't take anything for granted. And I have a birth certificate in North Platte, Nebraska. But my point is, we have all been raised, and our world has been, America has dominated the world. No questions asked, that's it. We've told people what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And if you didn't comply with our standard at our time, then you weren't measuring up. Now, I said earlier today we're not particularly good at reviewing history. In 1776, when this whole Grand Republic was started, the preamble of the Constitution didn't fit everybody. I mean, unless you were a white male-owning male, you didn't have any rights, essentially, or you had some, but not total. So we have 27 amendments to the Constitution for a reason, because we can self-correct. We have a Constitution that allows us to do that. I know there are some people in the Constitution business that don't think we should use the Constitution to self-correct, that we should be living like we did 100 years ago. But half the people in this room less than 100 years ago couldn't vote in the United States. The women of America didn't have the right to vote. So my point is this, that we can't go around judging the rest of the world based on American standards of 2016 because that's not how we were judged. That's not how we started. So the point being, to answer your question, we've had it our way. And anything that's gotten in the way of that, we've said, well, that can't stand. You're dealing with America, and you're going to do it our way. Well, now we're living at a whole different time in the world. We are living at a time of the greatest diffusion of economic power the world's ever seen. With that has come economic power. With that economic power has come political power, decision-making power, people wanting to make their own choices, their own way, and we see it in our own allies in Japan, South Korea, Philippines, over the years. And so when we talk about America getting involved in another country, committing American troops, we should always ask the tough questions first. Of course, because this question has to be asked, is it in America's interest? And one certainty in world affairs always is that every nation responds in its own self-interest. Every nation does. We do. And there's something very, very positive about that certainty, because it is uncertainty that leads to most trouble. When you're not certain. The young kid in North Korea, very little certainty there on what that fellow's got up his sleeve. The Iranian dimension of, well, exactly who's in charge, where's all this going? I think there's great uncertainty in China, by the way. But without going into those countries, staying with your question, that's the first thing. Is it in our self-interest? Then you have to ask the next set of questions, which I alluded to earlier. Then what happens, then what happens, then what happens? And the last question should be, what Colin Powell used to talk about, is do you have an exit strategy? Easy to get into war, not very easy to get out of war. You mentioned more and more Marines going into Iraq. We've got special operations now in Syria. We've got special operations in Africa. These are boots on the ground. These are not just flyers. These are people on the ground. So you're going to have casualties. And the Marine, his death a couple of days ago, I mean, that wasn't the first, by the way, and it won't be the last. So how do you get out of this mess? I mean, you can get in, but then what's the objective here as well? I have always taken the approach that I don't think there's any absolute fast rule about intervention, military intervention. I think you've got to always assess it based on history, frames of reference, allies, your interests. What can you do? I mean, what is most likely the outcome? We are the most powerful military in the world. No one's in our class. So I suppose you can continue bombing and bombing and bombing for a long time. But I'm not sure what that produces other than more hatred. And we don't always think through that. The specific examples that you mentioned, I actually was in the Senate at the time during the whole debate leading up to the Iraq invasion. I'm the one that forced the Bush administration to come to Congress with a resolution. They were not going to come to Congress with a resolution to go to war in Iraq. I got Joe Biden and Dick Lugar, and we worked on it, and the Bush administration came forward. It wasn't the original resolution they sent up, which was a joke, which was allowed the administration to go to war anywhere in the Middle East. But it still wasn't that good, because it was my point always, if we're going to intervene like we did in Desert Storm, some of you may have been in that war, let's do it the smart way, the way President George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker and Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft did it. You go to the UN resolution, you get all the players with you, and there was only one Middle East country, by the way, that was not with us on that on the Desert Storm campaign, and that was intentional, and that was Jordan. And the reason we decided, I wasn't in the administration at the time, but the reason the administration decided to hold Jordan out was because they felt that Saddam Hussein needed someone to talk to that wasn't part of that coalition. That would have been the way to do it. We didn't understand what we were doing. We didn't understand how long it would be. I was in committee hearing after committee hearing on the Foreign Relations Committee when the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the commanding general of our army in Iraq would come before us and say, public testimony, we'll be out of there in a year. We'll have our troops out by Christmas. And I'll never forget Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz saying, it won't cost the American taxpayer $1. Because Iraq has so much money and they'll reimburse us for everything. Well, none of that turned out quite that way. So you can always rely on it will never go the way you think it will go. Are there times when probably we should, with allies in the interest, entertain, but an involvement? I think we've always got to look at that, and I think that always has to be a factor in our foreign policy, where other leaders who have a little different approach than ours, and who are not always wanting to help us out for their own self-interest, they've got to also know that we will use the power, but not lead with military power. You use military power to enforce diplomacy, to enforce your foreign policy, which has to be the framework. You mentioned Syria. That is, well, if I was there, if I would have been in the administration during Libya, I would have, that decision I think was a mistake. I would have taken the same position that my predecessor, Secretary Gates, took at the time. He was opposed to America's involvement in the attacks on Gaddafi. I was in the administration during the whole Red Line episode with Syria, and I do think it was a mistake that we backed away, and the president, within hours after he had gone ahead and ordered the operation, pulled it down. And I've always believed it was a mistake. Matter of fact, there's an editorial today in the Washington Post by Jackson Deal. If you've not read it, you should read it. In fact, it makes, the reason I'm recommending it is because I agree with it. No, that's not the reason I'm recommending it, but he says it very, very well as to essentially why I thought the president had to do something. And when a president of the United States speaks, we Americans may think it's just some, oh, so what, the president just said something. That's not the way the world looks at it, especially during war. The rest of the world pays attention to what the president of the United States says. And when he threatens, and when he says something, both our adversaries and our allies believe that means something. And when it doesn't mean anything, there will be consequences to that. And I think there have been consequences. It produced a vacuum. The Russians came in a year later. I think the Russians did some other things. But I think, there's no way anybody will ever prove it unless Putin writes his memoirs and explains that, but which I don't think will be forthcoming anytime soon. But it probably eventually will come out one way or the other. But that case, and by the way, it's never a decision between you should attack militarily, you use your military assets, but the question is, what do you attack? What do you wish to accomplish with an attack? And there were other options without attacking Assad's military that would have done far more damage to Assad than attacking his military. And those were the options we presented to the president. We presented a lot of options to the president, but he chose what I think, well, not I think, it was unanimous in the National Security Council was the right option. So it's never black and white in my opinion. And I think before a president makes a big decision like that, he needs, and his team needs to weigh all those dynamics. And then they come to these are all imperfect decisions. There's no roadmap for any of this. There's no blueprint for, well, what do you do with ISIS? Or all of a sudden, we've got this problem. You're confronted with this kind of dilemma all the time. As I said, the next president is really, really going to have a lot of this, I think. And I think that's going to be our world for a while, unfortunately, before it starts to stabilize. I think it eventually will, for a lot of reasons, but we're going to be living with this great uncertainty for a while.
I think that's a good transition point where we go from my questions to the questions in the audience. So I'd like to open it up. A couple things first. We're going to have microphones, so please go to the microphone, speak into the microphone. The second thing is you get one question. So your four-part question means I get to choose the one that interests me the most and ask the secretary to answer that. So please raise your hand if you have a question. Great. Yes, in the back there.
Hi, Secretary Hagel. Thank you for being here. My name is Jeff. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service. My question is about a recent turn of events. President Putin has announced that he wants that the Russians are going to withdraw from Syria. I believe that happened just a few weeks back. What do you make of that turn, and how do you think that's going to affect the groundwork in Syria? Thank you.
Thank you. The decision that was announced just like 2 weeks ago, so it was a pretty recent decision, has so far resulted in about, I think, 15 aircraft being removed, maybe a few more by now, some of their ground troops, but also, and you always have to know that there's more to it in dealing with the Russians than just the initial announcement. And you shouldn't blast too many headlines out until you get the rest of the story, which we're now getting. First of all, I think it's positive to remove any military assets. But the fact is, as the Russians have now said, that they're keeping a few thousand ground troops still in Syria. They're not giving up those bases. They're keeping aircraft there. They're still conducting airstrikes and refueling. So what you've seen is, yes, you've seen some of those assets go out, but my guess is before they ever put them in, they knew exactly what they were doing, that they would, at some point when they felt Assad was stabilized enough, they could pull some out. But here's the other, in my opinion, the real reason. It was at the right time for the diplomatic efforts as they were moving forward on ceasefire, on trying to get the opposition and the Assad governments and the other governments involved to the negotiating table. It has produced for Putin probably the strongest hand of anybody sitting at the table. He has essentially saved Assad's regime. The Iranians are de facto partners in keeping Assad propped up, and I don't think it's for either side it's any great admiration or love for Assad. It's for their own interests. The Russians have essentially been able to dictate the diplomatic dynamics of this. They have been very clever how they've played their strikes. There will not be any resolution or any platform of stability constructed without the Russians. So I think all that probably went into his decision too, and I think he probably got some credit on the world stage. We're starting to withdraw some of those assets, but there are still significant Russian military assets in Syria, and I don't look for those leaving anytime soon. So bottom line for me is I think it was a strategic win for Putin. How he was able to do it, the vacuum that he saw that he used, to very minimal cost to the Russians, by the way. Yeah, they weren't going to and wouldn't be able to sustain that kind of expense, especially with oil floating between $35 and $40 a barrel. And even if it would get to 50, he's still not going to be able to sustain it. I don't think there's any question, at least in my mind, that when they took the action they did, they already had Colin Powell's list in front of them. And remember, the last part of Colin Powell's list before you entertain getting involved militarily somewhere, what's your exit strategy? I think strategically they had thought through that. Now, does anything ever go exactly as the blueprint? No. No matter how smart you are, it never does. You can always be sure that all the uncontrollables will be there and are there, and they will affect you. And the unknowns and the surprises, both good and bad. But you've got to come at these things strategically, not tactically. And I think if America had been more strategic over the last 15 years in how we've approached Afghanistan, the Middle East, right up until today, I think we'd be in a better position on higher ground. So I'm not a Putin enthusiast or an apologist, but I think for what Putin was playing with, the asset hand he had, I think he's probably done pretty well. At the same time, too, that he was confronting and still confronting oil prices and natural gas prices at essentially record lows, and his economy is in shambles, and he can't sustain it. I mean, I think he's driving his economy into a ditch, but the Russians, I suspect, will go with him, will hang with him for at least a while longer, but he needs the daylight. He needs a resolution here on this. This is my point earlier about let's find common interests. What does Putin need and what do we need? But most importantly, what's best for the Middle East? And the countries of the Middle East are going to have to step up to this because there'll be no resolution in the Middle East, regardless if Putin wants to continue a proxy war, which the Iranians are good at, and they continue it, and it's what he's been doing. We essentially have been doing some of that. Where's that all going to lead? Well, it'll be the continuous destruction of the Middle East. There'll be nothing left, and you'll continue to put hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees on boats fleeing into Europe and elsewhere to get away from it, and the more pressure on everybody else. So the ripple effect here is getting to be pretty significant, but it'll get worse. So everybody needs a way out of this, and let's take advantage of that, and let's be smart about that.
Thank you. Yes, here in front. Yeah, you.
Thanks again, Secretary Hagel, for speaking with us today. My name is Aditya, also a senior undergrad in the School of Foreign Service. Going off the last question about Russia, where do you see the transformation of the U.S. and NATO strategic posturing towards Russia, both in terms of a shift from a focus on asymmetric warfare back towards high-end warfare, and in terms of naval coordination, both in the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea and even the Black Sea going forward? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I think if you look at where the Chinese and the Russians have applied their resources and what capabilities have they been building at a significantly alarming rate in their capability inventory are the high-end, high technology areas. And that's certainly cyber. The sophistication of their missile delivery capabilities, the deadliness of their weapons, their radar systems, their penetration capabilities. They're moving in the right directions for them, but for modern warfare. And quantity is always important, but now it is a game of quality more than ever before, and it'll continue to be the quality of those weapons because it is changing completely the entire paradigm of warfare, the sophistication of weapons. And I'm not talking just nuclear. I'm talking about conventional capabilities. So you probably noticed recently the Russians and the Chinese have both cut their defense budgets going into this year. Now, especially the Chinese, there's no transparency with the Chinese ever in anything. So we're not sure of what they're really doing, what they're not doing. We have good intelligence, but we really don't know. We probably have a much better measurement of the Russians for a lot of reasons. But we are pretty sure that they are cutting their defense budgets. But we know where they've been putting their money. We've been following all of that. And so have we, by the way. We're not holding back our commitment to our long term. In fact, I 2 years ago announced the Defense Innovation Initiative at the Ronald Reagan Library in California to start changing DoD's paradigm of where we go for new technologies and sharing. And up until recently, we relied much on inside Pentagon research. Many of you know about DARPA, which is a very, very high security, top secret entity within the Pentagon since World War II to develop really space age technology on everything. And they've been tremendous. They still are. But we need to share, we need the sharing with the private sector a lot more than we have been. And I think, by the way, just taking aside from that point, the future of the federal government, in my opinion, in the United States, whether it's defense or the Veterans Administration or hospitalization or anything, is going to be more and more private sharing. And if for no other reason, we can't afford it. And we're losing efficiencies here that we should not be losing. We're the country that invents about everything. And that doesn't mean we're better people. It doesn't mean, in my opinion, that God has chosen America to be his country. I know some people believe that, but I don't think that's true. We'll all find out at some point. I'm not in any hurry, but to do that. But the fact is, we're ahead of everybody on this. But the private sector needs to be connected into this, just like we were talking about cyber. We're not going to fix this cyber issue inside the government. It's not going to happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it kind of gives you maybe a little broader view of if you want to pursue. If I didn't answer it, tell me. Okay.
Thanks. Yes, on the side there. Yes, right there.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, Secretary Hagel. I was wondering if I could get your opinion on whether the United States and China can avoid the Thucydides trap.
The what trap?
The Thucydides trap, it's the concept of a rising power challenging established power. It's what President Xi Jinping mentioned when he visited.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can. I think we both can. And I think we will. I think the Chinese are too smart to fall into that trap. I hope the Americans are too smart to fall into that trap. We just have too much common interest. I mean, again, you look at two countries, two societies, two universes of influence. I mean, no one is even in the same league as the Chinese and the United States. We cannot afford to undo each other for the world, too. I mean, and it's not in either one of our interests. Will there be always, I suspect in our lifetimes, a continuation of differences and issues and problems and so on? Yes. But hell, we have those with our oldest allies still. The British, the French, Australians. I mean, we have differences. But the relationship there is so strong, and I don't envision the Chinese and the Russians ever becoming our partners, certainly in our lifetime, like the British or the French or Australia, some of our other close allies. But we've got to maneuver through this, and I'll use a term that I don't think gets used enough because somehow it, I guess, with the journalistic nonsense that's out there that dictates so much of the headlines and the confrontation and conflict, the term is manage. And I know that's kind of a wishy-washy word. Well, it's not a strong doctrine. Where's the doctrine? The absolutism of a doctrine. Well, absolutism will get you in a lot of trouble to start with. It's paralyzed our government. It's paralyzed our politics because we have a political process now that reflects the absolutism of I'm all right, And I'm all right all the time, you're all wrong all the time. So why should I even talk to you? Because you're stupid. Because I'm absolutely right. That's what our politics has come to today. And that's why our Congress and our president, our Congress can't even internally get along. And so you've always got that dimension out there in world affairs. But because of the things I've talked about, and you all know very well, environment, energy, cyber, realities of all bumping along together in a world of 7 billion, soon to be 9 billion people, I mean, we have no alternative here. Yeah, because if we don't bump along here and get along and figure this out, then we will destroy the world. We'll destroy each other, and we have that capability now. And I think managing all this, back to my term manage, is really the most important word I can use. And again, I know it's kind of poo-pooed by everybody. It's not strong and so on. But managing everything day to day is tough to do. Manage your own lives every day. Some of you may not have any problem with that, and God love you, that's good. But I'll tell you, the older you get, you're going to be taking on more responsibilities and more things that will impact your lives and how you see the world and what your responsibilities are, and you're going to have to manage that. Every person who has any responsibility for anything has to manage. It's a boring term, I know, but boy, it applies to the world. And I think we'll manage it. I really do. I just think inherently the world is still full of too many good people and too many wise people. I don't really care about smart people. They're okay. It's better to be smart, I guess, than dumb. But I want them wise. Because in the end, it's judgment. It's not how many degrees you have or how smart you are. It's judgment. That's the fundamental responsibility of a leader. When you got to sit around that table and you don't know, and you use your judgment. So, I didn't mean this to be a commencement speech, but I do think it factors into the things we're talking about.
Fantastic. Great. Sorry. Yes, please, in the front.
Hi, my name is Kristen, and I'm a sophomore in the SFS. You were speaking a little bit about the distortion of an entire religion, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. In regards to protecting our national security and the threat of terror, how do we make it appear as if we're not going to war against an entire religion into other countries? They seem to think that we are. What are your policy prescriptions for preventing that perception?
Well, I think that's a question is a fundamental question, and as important a question as we need to all ask ourselves, especially policymakers, because I think you're right. In my opinion, what's happening in the Middle East, much of North Africa, is a combination of a number of things. It is a result of a political dysfunction, of an economic disaster with no opportunities, mainly in Islamic countries. Then you couple that with the history of European colonization, historic sectarian divisions, specifically between Sunnis and Shias in the Muslim world, tribal, ethnic, cultural, historic differences. And you put all that together and you got a pretty toxic brew. And I think the lashing out at the United States in the West is not unfounded in some respects. I get it. But I think the West and the United States take the brunt of this. You're talking about the distortion of religion, which ISIS uses, Al-Qaeda uses, al-Nusra uses. There are at least a dozen sophisticated terrorist groups that fancy themselves in some way to be part of an Islamic culture that's only the true Islamic culture. And it is, in my opinion, for the reasons I just mentioned, how they get away with it and their ability to use social media, to use the tools that are available. And you can go right back to ISIS's tremendously impressive military strategic tactical prowess that has come directly from many of the senior officers of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist army that we disbanded mindlessly. We disbanded their government. We disbanded their party. We disbanded their military, and foolishly believed that we could impose American institutions and democracies on Iraqis. And we know what's happened. But the ripple effect of that, just as one piece of all this, has really come back to haunt us in many ways. So your question, how do you combat it? How do you deal with it? I think first a recognition, if I'm at all right, maybe I'm wrong. But if I'm at all right, then I think a recognition of what I've just said. Then working with the governments and the countries and the people of those areas. Now, I know you could say, yeah, but a lot of them are monarchies and they're really dictatorships and so on and so on. And what about Egypt? Egypt, you know, now President Sisi's a general and they overthrew an elected democracy. Well, again, ding, 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 go back to my earlier comments about America 1776, America 1900. If the majority of people in Egypt or any country in the world, specifically the Middle East, believe that the Muslim Brotherhood or any force there is a threat to their economy, to their country, to their beliefs, to their future, to their children, we're not going to change that by saying, yeah, but there was an election and there was a Muslim Brotherhood representative was elected president, so therefore it's a democracy, therefore it's all going to work out. Now that may be our perception, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm not an Egyptian. I've never told any leader of another country what their priorities should be. I mean, I've got a lot of flaws, but I'm not that arrogant, and I hope not that stupid to go tell another leader, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey. When Erdogan told me a year ago, our biggest threat to Turkey is not ISIS, it's the Kurds. Well, we have a little different view of that, but I'm not going to tell the president of Turkey, who's a citizen and born and raised. Now, we have a different view of Kurds. Now, as I said, you know, you get into, are there bad Americans and good Americans? Are there bad Kurds and good Kurds? I mean, what Kurds are you talking about? So without getting too esoteric here, we got to work with the leaders, the countries, the people of the region, because ultimately they're going to have sorted out. They're going to have to determine what they will tolerate and what they won't tolerate for themselves. We can help them, but I don't think we help them by invading countries and occupying countries. I mean, we were asked to leave Iraq. I mean, the fact is, President Obama, I don't understand how the media so continually misstates this, but it wasn't President Obama who pulled America out of Iraq. It was President Bush who signed an agreement with Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki in December of 2008 to withdraw all of American forces no later than 2011. And the reason that President Bush did that, he had to do it, is because Maliki said he would not take to the parliament in Iraq a new status of forces agreement to protect American forces. And we've never put American forces in a country where we don't have a status of forces agreement which protects our troops. Maliki further said, and I was on the Foreign Relations Committee at the time, so I was right in the middle of it with Secretary Rice and others, that we were seen as occupiers and invaders, and the Iraqi people wanted us out. And Maliki would not go before the parliament and try to defend the continuation of American troops in Iraq. Now, we can argue with that. We can say you're wrong or however you want to do it. But if, in fact, eventually, after about the fourth explanation as to why we invaded Iraq, was to help build a democracy. Well, I guess we achieved it, didn't we? I mean, if you judge it on the basis that they have an elected prime minister, a new constitution, and so on and so on. Now, whether they screw it up or not, I'm not sure we can control that. And they want us out because they see us as occupiers. Those were his words, not mine, by the way. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, working with the people there and how you can help them, you can support them, you can do what you can. And I think we have to be careful in our latest slide back into Iraq that we're not sliding right back into a bad situation. But we'll see. And I think it's Syria, Afghanistan's continues to be a problem. The deterioration of Afghanistan. Just make one last point on this. If you do not allow the people of a region or a country or a society to make their own choices and their own decisions, and it's messy. Ours wasn't pretty how we started. And I don't think until we had a civil war in 1860 that we really started to kind of fulfill the destiny of this country. And we're still not where we need to be. Made tremendous progress, I think, everywhere. But we got to be careful here when we're looking at other countries, and it does take time sometimes to kind of let people get to where they want to go, and their center of gravity has to come sometimes on their own time. And we've learned some tough lessons on this. And again, I'm not one who advocates just staying out of everything. I'm not a Bernie Sanders or some of the essentially the isolationists. We can't retreat. America cannot retreat. There's no other country in the world that can help lead the world. We shouldn't dictate to the world, try to govern the world, impose our values and standards on everybody, or certainly invade and occupy. But no other nation can bring people together. And we can help do that in the Middle East, in North Africa. But as I said earlier, this is going to take a while. We're going to have to adjust to that reality.
With apologies to the many people who would still like to ask the question, we've reached the end of our time with Secretary Hagel. I think his last remarks were a suitably humbling note for all of us. Before we all rush off to our next appointments, please join me in thanking him for a very stimulating time. Thank you.